In this session, we're going to talk about Chapter 8 of Getting to Yes. Chapter 8 concerns what happens if the other side uses dirty tricks. This is a really important chapter because as we're learning to be principled negotiators, sometimes people mistake principled negotiating with being overly trusting, being overly nice, and that's not true at all. People who are overly trusting and overly nice tend to be soft negotiators, not principled negotiators. As principled negotiators, we always have to be aware of the fact that the other side may try to take advantage of us as negotiators. When they're exploring our interests and pretending to be a principled negotiator, they may have ulterior motives in mind. So, this is an important chapter to put us on alert for the typical types of dirty tricks some negotiators might play. The book talks about 3 different types of categories of playing dirty. The first is deliberate deception, when people just outright lie to you and manipulate you. The second category is use of psychological warfare, and we'll talk about what some examples of that are in a little bit. And the final category we're going to be discussing is positional pressure tactics. Number 1, typical dirty tricks, deliberate deception. There are 3 primary categories of deliberate deception that your authors talk about. First of all, phony facts. Now, as we've learned a long time ago, there's no such thing as a phony fact, because if it's not true, it's not a fact. Right? But this is the category your authors use. A phony fact is an outright lie. The negotiator tells you on the other side something that's not true, or makes a representation that is not true. Number 2 is a common form of deliberate deception. A party will send a negotiator into a negotiation and conduct the negotiation almost to the very end to get you to make as many concessions as possible. And then, when you think you're at an agreement, the party on the other side, the negotiator on the other side says, you know, I'm not the one on behalf of my company who's authorized to conclude this agreement. It's now going to have to go to X. X might be the board of directors. X might be the officer at the company above the person you've been negotiating with. And what they use that for is then for when you go to the next level that they tell you you have to go to, they want to take all of the concessions you've made in your negotiation and take that as the starting basis to get you to give up even more concessions. To say something like, well, this is almost there, but what we need you to do at this point is give us an additional X amount of dollars. It's a very common tactic that is deployed a lot in negotiations. And the final category of deliberate deception is what's called ambiguous intentions. And that is when the party on the other side may be making agreements that they have absolutely no real intent of abiding with. Or they're going to wait and see how things play out and then decide whether they're actually going to live up to their agreement or not. We saw ambiguous intentions in the inheritance negotiation. That is where Lennon said he was going to get his sibling, Skylar, to get him to live in the house for 3 years under whatever things he had to say. And then at the end of the 3 years, he had no intention of ever selling the house. He was just trying to buy himself some more time. Ambiguous intentions are related to happy contracts. We should never assume in the agreements we're making that the other party really intends to live up to their promises. And if they don't intend to live up to their promises, we need to realize that we have to make agreements for those contingencies. So, 3 different types of deliberate deception: being untruthful about the facts, pretending you have authority to make the agreement when in fact you don't, and not necessarily intending to abide by the promises you make in the negotiation. How are ways we can deal with deliberate deception? Number 1, and this is really important, and sorry to say, you should not trust anyone ever until they have proven to you that they can be trusted. When you are dealing with a stranger or someone who maybe you've done a little bit of business with but not a lot, do not trust them. You have to protect yourself or protect the party you're negotiating on behalf of. What are some of the ways we can do that? First of all, to the extent possible, you should always independently verify the facts. Don't rely on the other side making representations to you. Right? Find out for yourself what the facts really are. I think I gave you this example earlier on in the semester with respect to my client who was trying to buy a cemetery. And the other side just wouldn't give us the information we needed to satisfy ourselves that the cemetery was rid of the problems that it had in the past. And the party on the other side said to me, we'll just make a representation and warranty that these facts are true. You don't need to see anything. And the result of if we had done that, would have been that if they turned out not to be true, we would have wound up in another lawsuit. In contrast, if we satisfy ourselves by our independent investigation that the facts are true, we don't have to worry about that. So, whenever possible, independently verifying the facts is very important. With respect to ambiguous authority, it is very important, sometimes a little awkward to do it, but very important to establish at the outset of your negotiation that the person you're negotiating with has the power to conclude the negotiation. And the only way you can do that is by outright asking them, before we begin, I just want to make clear that if we reach an agreement today, you are authorized to bind your company to it. And if they say no, then suggest that the person with the authority be part of the negotiation. Maybe at least be available on the telephone so that as things go along, you can make sure that the power with authority to enter into the agreement is involved in the process. Finally, with respect to ambiguous intentions, as I said before, this is related to making happy contracts. Don't ever assume the other side will perform its promises. You have to take each item of agreement in the contract and ask yourself, if that agreement is not satisfied, what plans do you want to have in place to provide a contingency? In our inheritance negotiation, for example, Lennon promised that if he couldn't buy out Schuyler's interest at the end of the 3 years, he would put the house on the market and sell it to a third party. But look what happened in real life. He didn't buy out his siblings' interest, but then when it was time to put the house on the market, he did things like, first of all, refusing to agree on a real estate agent, and secondly, once a real estate agent was selected, locking the gate to the premises so the real estate agent couldn't come in and show the property to any potential clients. With respect to the promise that any dispute would be presented to a private judge, he just didn't pay the private judge her fees. And that way she couldn't go forward with the case. So, with respect to every single one of those things that go into the contract, you have to stop and say, but if it doesn't happen, what am I going to insist that the other side agree to? And that is how you protect yourself from someone who's making promises that they may not intend to be living up to at the end. The second category of typical dirty tricks is psychological warfare. These are things designed to make you either emotionally or physically uncomfortable, right, so that you can't stay focused on the negotiation or the situation at hand. Stressful situations. Some example of stressful situations is putting you in a room that is freezing, or putting you in a room that is way too hot, or going straight on without taking a break for lunch, not having water available. Maybe you're in a situation where there's no place that you can go out and meet in private or make a private phone call to someone that you need to speak to. There was a lawyer who I once encountered who used to brag about the fact she was a transactional lawyer, and she did a lot of motion picture financial work, and the motion picture financing documents would often be hundreds of pages long. And when the other side would come in to review the documents, she used to brag about the fact that she would go down and bribe the guys in the boiler room, this is back in the days where there were boiler rooms, to crank up the heat as high as possible. And the purpose for her to do that was to make it so physically uncomfortable in the room that the lawyers on the other side couldn't focus on reviewing the documents. Another type of psychological warfare, making personal attacks on the other side, questioning their integrity, questioning their intelligence, anything to make them defensive, uncomfortable. Good guy, bad guy. We've all seen that in the old cop shows. Someone is a hard negotiator, really tough on you, and then that person leaves the room, and in walks the good guy. Really like to help you out. If you could just give me a little of these few concessions, maybe I can go back and convince my partner to accept that. Also not an uncommon tactic. And finally, flat out threats. If you don't do this, we're going to sue you. If we don't do this, we're going to take it to the newspapers. Threats to make you feel frightened and uncomfortable in your negotiation. So, if someone deploys these types of psychological warfare tricks, how can you protect yourself against them? First of all, if you find yourself in a position where you're in physically uncomfortable circumstances, it's too hot, it's too cold, you need a place to talk in private, call it out. Say, it's too hot in this room, I can't concentrate. We need to move to another place. Or I need to have a spot where I can confer with my client or with my partners. And insist that the environment change. Take yourself out of the physical discomfort. Number two, if someone's making personal attacks on you, call them out. Say, I know you're trying to do that to keep me unfocused on what we're here to accomplish. Please refrain from doing that. Keep your personal insults to yourself. Good guy, bad guy, recognize it. You can call out that tactic as well. I see what you're doing here. It's the old good guy, bad guy cop show. But let's just try to stay focused on our negotiation. Right? We don't need to play around with good cop, bad cop. Finally, if threats are made to you, just be principled in responding to them. Don't make them back. Your authors suggest that warnings are much more effective than threats. Right? You can see if we can't reach agreement here, I'm going to have to go back to my contingency, and there's a possibility they could go out on strike. More of a warning than, and if you don't give us this, we're going to be striking tomorrow. So, various ways you can deal with psychological warfare. The primary theme here is, if you are in these circumstances, call them out for what they are. Don't put up with them, but let the other side know you know what they're trying to do. Finally, other typical dirty tricks, positional pressure tactics. There's several of them that your book talks about. Someone's absolute refusal to negotiate. They just won't do it. That is not uncommon among lawyers. Lawyers actually do that a lot. My demand is X, and I'm not budging from it. So a form of positional bargaining. How do you deal with refusal to negotiate? There have been several occasions where I've encountered a lawyer who has refused to negotiate, won't back down from their position. And I have had to say to my client, you know, you have to take the lawyers out of the picture or you'll never reach an agreement. If you leave it to the lawyers, I'll tell you right now, no agreement will ever be made. So take the lawyers out of the picture, go face to face with the client on the other side. The difficult negotiator out of the picture, because the parties ultimately do want to reach an agreement, right? That's why they're talking to you. In every instance where I did that, where I finally threw up my hands and said it's never going to happen between the lawyers, the clients were able to successfully negotiate their agreement. So if you have that option, right? If you're just negotiating with one other person and there's no client or no company to report to, you don't have that option because you can't take them out of the picture. But if you do, that is a tactic that you can use. Extreme demands, that's people making really low offers or really high requests, trying to set your baseline as low or as high as possible. Escalating demands, that's when somebody, every time there's a go-around, increases their demands rather than working toward a compromise. Right? If you're not going to agree to my offer, I'm going to increase it. Right? I'm going to demand more from you. Lock-in tactics, again, that's where a kind of a refusal to negotiate. They get themselves in a position where they say they're just not going to budge any further. Hard-hearted partner, that's a little bit like good cop, bad cop. You know, I would give this to you, but I've got to report to my boss, and my boss just won't budge. It's kind of the good cop, bad cop thing. Calculated delay. Calculated delay is one that I really want to focus on because people use this tactic all the time. They try to get you in a position where you're backed up against some deadline before they begin the negotiation, so that you have the pressure of needing to make a deal before the negotiation deadline elapses. This is a very effective technique because it's our human nature to want to put difficult things off. So if we're facing a difficult negotiation and the other side calls up and says, hey, something came up, is it okay if we postpone this by 2 weeks? It's our nature to want to say, sure, you know, I'm happy to put it off. But what happens time and time again is that creates added pressure on you because you have less of a time to negotiate and less of a time to look for alternatives if you don't reach a successful agreement. Lawyers do this all the time, particularly in litigation, because there's all sorts of deadlines built into litigation. For example, you have to complete all of your discovery at least 30 days before the trial is scheduled to start. Discovery is things like written questions, depositions. And what lawyers inevitably will do is back you up as close to that 30 days as possible. Oh, my client's sick. Can we continue it? Oh, I got this trial. I thought it was going to settle, but it didn't, so now I have to be in trial. And they'll push the other side to agree to get closer and closer to that 30-day cutoff. And then, as they're right against the 30-day cutoff, they'll refuse to show up for the deposition, or they'll refuse to provide their written responses to questions. And then you have to go into court on an emergency basis so that it can take place before the 30 days. And inevitably, the judge is going to say to you, why should I give you special relief? Why did you take so long to get this done? So, as much as we want to put off unpleasant things, including unpleasant negotiations, it is very important to make sure we are negotiating far enough in advance that we have room for extended negotiation, or we have room to look somewhere else if we aren't able to reach agreement. The more space and time you leave yourself, the better position you'll be in. I got a little bit ahead of myself when I was talking about that because I feel so strongly about that. Ways to deal with positional pressure tactics. Right. Find out their interest in not negotiating. Try to get third parties involved. Call out their tactics for what they are. You can say, if you're not going to budge from your position, we're not going to reach an agreement. And what I already talked about, never, ever let yourself be backed up against a deadline. And finally, always remember, when everything else fails, don't be afraid to walk away from the negotiation. Leave yourself that option. And remember, making it easier to walk away is having a strong BATNA. So again, I can't emphasize enough, the preparation you should do walking into a negotiation is to make sure you have the strongest plan B possible so that if you need to, you can walk away.